He sold my piano for $200. That is how my story begins, though the real story began long before the money ever changed hands, before the movers came and the garage door opened like a mouth ready to swallow everything that once made a life sound like itself. I was in the kitchen that morning, buttering toast I didn't even want, when Mark walked in with that falsely bright tone people use when they are about to do something unforgivable but want to believe it's practical. "You'll thank me later, Mom," he said. I remember the sunlight catching in the window and reflecting off the polished lid of the Steinway that had been with me since I was 23. The same piano that had traveled from one rented apartment to another, that had survived a marriage, fire, and the years when I taught lessons for $5 an hour just to keep the lights on. He didn't look at it. He looked at me, the way you look at a piece of furniture you've already decided to sell. That was the moment I realized the worst kind of cruelty doesn't come with shouting. It comes with management, with soft voices explaining why it's for the best. I should have said something then, but I didn't. I had raised him to be confident, decisive, capable of taking care of things, and now he was taking care of me out of existence. When he told me the buyer was a collector from Craigslist, I almost laughed. That phrase alone should have been warning enough. But I just nodded, pretending the air didn't feel suddenly thin. The movers came 2 hours later. 2 boys with tattoos on their forearms and the distracted politeness of those who handle other people's pasts for a living. They wrapped the piano in gray blankets, not gently, not cruelly, just efficiently. The hollow thump of the lid closing sounded like a door shutting somewhere deep inside my chest. I wanted to touch it one more time, to play a single chord, but Mark was already talking about parking space and the treadmill he planned to put there. "You don't use it anymore, Mom?" he said, as if use were the only proof of love. He handed me $200 in folded bills, not even counted out properly, and pressed them into my palm like a tip. I left the money on the counter beside the toaster, and by the time I turned back, the truck was already gone. That night the house was quiet in the wrong way. For 60 years, silence had always been a pause between notes, never the whole song. I sat in the armchair by the window and kept hearing phantom music, as if the air itself refused to admit the absence. Mark and his wife Jill were in the living room watching something bright and fast-talking on TV. They laughed too loudly, the way people do when they are relieved the uncomfortable part of the day is over. I wanted to tell them about the day I bought that piano, how I had walked 6 blocks in heels that blistered my feet to a second-hand shop run by an old man who tuned by ear and believed in ghosts. But I knew they wouldn't listen. They had already decided my memories were clutter. Weeks passed. The space where the piano had stood became a fitness corner, and each morning the treadmill roared to life like a mechanical reminder of everything that could no longer breathe naturally. I tried to tell myself that it didn't matter, that an object, no matter how precious, was still just wood and wire. But every time I saw the empty wall, I felt the kind of vertigo that comes when you reach for a handrail that used to be there. Sometimes, out of habit, I would glance toward the spot at dusk, expecting to see the faint reflection of keys in the window pane. Once I even caught myself whispering a scale under my breath, fingers moving against my thigh, tracing melodies no one else could hear. Jill noticed and said gently, "You should get out more, Mom." I smiled. "I'm already out," I said, but she didn't understand. It wasn't until months later that I realized what the sale had truly taken. It wasn't the instrument. It was the permission to remember who I had been when music still meant something. Without it, the days folded into each other like unplayed pages. I stopped correcting the grandchildren when they called me Grandma M. I stopped arguing with Mark about anything, because every argument ended with the same line: "You worry too much." Maybe I did. Maybe worrying was the only music left in me. I tried once to visit the buyer, found the old email thread, the address, a name I couldn't quite read. But Mark caught me searching and gently closed the laptop, saying, "Let it go, Mom. It's just stuff." That night, lying in bed, I imagined the piano sitting in some stranger's room, maybe untouched, maybe repainted, maybe being played by hands that had never once shaken from age or regret. I wondered if instruments remember who loved them, or if they're grateful just to be played at all. I think that was when something inside me began to go still. The world outside kept moving, neighbors mowing lawns, delivery trucks sighing down the street, but I felt like I'd been placed on a shelf, dusted occasionally, expected to be quiet. Then one evening, when the news was murmuring in the background and the light was slipping away in that thin metallic way it does before rain, I heard a reporter's voice mention a remarkable discovery. I looked up. On the screen was my piano, unmistakable even under the studio lights. The same faded walnut, the same tiny dent under middle C. The headline read, "Rare 1941 Steinway found in garage sale, worth over $2 million. My breath caught not because of the money, but because of the sound. It was being played alive again by someone who didn't know me at all. The camera panned over the keys, and for a moment I felt both proud and completely erased. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I turned off the television, sat very still, and listened to the silence that followed. It was heavier than music, but it was mine. He told me it was charity, and he said it with the kind of easy smile people use when they are rearranging someone else's life into a shape they can tolerate. And at first I believed him, because I wanted to believe that the son I had raised with midnight feedings and cold coffee and whispered urgencies would somehow tuck my things away with the same careful hands that used to braid my hair when storms came. I believed him until I found the empty space where the piano had lived for 50 years, until I ran my palm along the wall and felt only paint and the faint outline of dust that marked where a lid had once cast a shadow. And then the world narrowed to the color of the wood that wasn't there anymore, and the light that bounced off, a surface I could no longer see. I remember the morning as though someone else had been inside me that day, the kitchen humming with the ordinary noises of breakfast, while Mark moved through the rooms like a man tidying up a house he had only just learned to call his own. And he said, in that very ordinary voice, that he had given it away because it was heavy, because it took up space, because it reminded him of a life he preferred in pictures rather than in the messy, breathing shape of memory. And he put $200 on the counter as if money could mend the missing sound, and left me to make sense of how a thing I had loved could be dismissed with so little ceremony. I sat very still for a long time after they left, feeling the slow unspool of a life's architecture. And in that stillness, the betrayal did not roar but seeped in like cold through a window pane. It was a betrayal made domestic, wrapped in pragmatism and polite concern, and it taught me a new kind of violence, the kind that arrives in gentle hands and explains that you will be happier without the burden of who you used to be. There were practical things to do, of course, as if that might anchor me. I asked a neighbor if she had seen where the men with the blankets had gone, I called the number Mark had given me for the collector and got a voicemail that sounded like a place that swallowed calls and never returned them, and I sat on the back steps while the day unmade itself into evening, feeling the memory of Middle C like a pulse beneath my ribs, and wondering whether an instrument could be owned by a name or by a story, whether the things that bear witness to us are somehow more ourselves than the people who carry our faces at grocery stores. The weeks that followed sketched themselves in small erasures. A stack of sheet music missing from the bookcase, a music stand left on the curb on trash day, pupils who came by less often for lessons because the address in my head no longer matched, the shape of a home with a piano in it, and each absence piled on the other until I could see the outline of a life reduced to its negative space, like a photograph left too long in the sun. People meant well. They said comforts. They brought casseroles that sat uneaten in the fridge because the taste of food had a way of bringing back the sound I could not have, and Mark would call from his office and tell me gently that I should get out more, should see friends, should not let objects tie me to times that had passed, and his voice would be steady and careful, the voice of someone who had made peace with losing parts of his past in order to make room for the present he preferred. But there are things that give a person backbone, and for me, the piano had been one of them, a place where my hands had learned the language of consolation and of argument and of laughter. To see it go, to have it shipped away like last season's furniture, was to discover that my authority over my own life could be negotiated without my consent, and that discovery made me both small and strangely furious in ways I had not expected. Anger visited me in unlikely hours while I was making tea, while I watered the plant on the sill, while a grandson asked me how to tie his shoes, and each time it arrived, it carried with it a hard, crystalline question that would not let me rest. Who decided what matters? The catalyst for everything was not the truck that hauled away the wood and the strings. It was the moment my son decided his tidy life mattered more than the continuity of mine, and in that decision, he had chosen to edit me out of my own story. After that choice was made, the rest of the world could continue as if nothing had happened. Neighbors would still borrow sugar, the mail would keep arriving, and the radio would play the same songs. But for me, the contour of every day had shifted. Inward, toward a hollow where a bright lid had once closed and left my knuckles smelling of polish and triumph. And because people who dismantle other people's pasts often do so with an eye on convenience rather than cruelty, I found myself doing things I had not planned to do. I tore through old papers. I found the deed and the receipts tucked into an old lesson book. I wrote down dates and descriptions with a hand that remembered the precise way the left-hand chords felt under my fingers, and somewhere in that small, private labor, a kind of resolve began to form, not loud or legalistic at first, but quiet and stubborn. A whisper that if my life had been moved without consultation, I would, in whatever small ways remained to me, reassemble it. The first sign that something in the world had tilted came quietly, as most lasting changes do, wrapped not in thunder, but in the steady rearrangement of the small details that make up a life. A woman who had spent decades building her days around the rhythm of order, watering plants at 9, reading at 10, a walk at noon, began to notice that the pattern no longer held its shape. She would forget the watering can by the back door, lose her place in the same paragraph twice, drift through the rooms as though her own furniture had shifted an inch to the left. There was no catastrophe, no clear act of betrayal, only the faint sense that her house had stopped breathing in harmony with her. She tried to ignore it at first, because ignoring was easier, because to name it would have meant confronting the possibility that her own habits had become strangers. Each morning, she would open the curtains to let in the light, only to find that the light itself seemed different, a little more clinical, less forgiving, as if it came from a place that no longer recognized her walls. The neighbors still waved, the postman still nodded, but there was a slowness in their gestures, a polite vagueness that implied she was now slightly out of frame in the picture they were all still part of. She began to keep lists, shopping, appointments, books to return, small anchors against the quiet drift. Yet the lists grew longer and less relevant, as though the act of writing them had become an end in itself, a way of insisting on meaning where none was offered. Sometimes she would catch her reflection in the glass of the hallway cabinet and be startled, not by age but by a certain unfamiliar alertness in her own eyes, a look that suggested she had started watching her life from the outside. Friends called, invitations were extended, polite laughter exchanged over tea, but beneath each exchange she could feel the slow tightening of distance, the way people instinctively pull back from a mystery they don't want to unravel. She thought of herself as a weather system that had shifted without warning, the kind of front that alters the air pressure but leaves the sky deceptively blue. What deepened the unease was how practical everything appeared on the surface. Bills were paid, meals cooked, the garden trimmed. Yet beneath those gestures ran a quiet rebellion of objects, a drawer that refused to close, a lamp that flickered though the bulb was new, a clock that gained 2 minutes every day no matter how often it was corrected. It was as though the physical world had conspired to remind her that permanence was a story humans told themselves out of necessity. She began to feel embarrassed by her own attempts to control it, the way she polished the table every morning, even though no one came to eat from it anymore, the way she arranged the cushions just so, as if symmetry could still summon company. One afternoon she visited the library, searching for something she could not name. The librarian, a young man with distracted kindness, recommended a book on time management. She smiled, took it home, and left it unopened on the counter. There was a peculiar comfort in that confusion, a sense of having slipped out of the schedule that ruled everyone else. Yet it was also the beginning of an ache that had no vocabulary. Over the following weeks her sleep grew lighter, her dreams louder. She began to hear music in the refrigerator's hum, conversations in the distant bark of dogs. Memory, she would pause, caught between amusement and alarm, and then return to her lists as though they were a lifeline. Each list was a small defiance, proof that she was still assembling days out of intention rather than inertia. It was what she had mistaken for loss was something quieter and more dangerous, an indifference that had settled like dust over everything she used to love. She had not been abandoned. She had simply stopped believing that her presence altered anything. The discovery was not accompanied by tears or revelation, only a long exhale, as if her lungs had finally admitted how long they had been holding their breath. From that point on, the smallest things began to carry disproportionate weight. The sound of a kettle, the click of the mailbox, the texture of bread cooling on the counter. She began to narrate these details in her head, perhaps to convince herself that she was still the author of her own days. But even that narration began to fray, its sentences longer, more hesitant, trailing off before they reached verbs. She wondered if this was how a person disappears, not through sudden absence, but through the slow erosion of language until the self becomes something witnessed rather than inhabited. One evening, a storm rolled in without warning, heavy and electric. The first thunderclap rattled the glass, and she found herself laughing, genuinely, as if the sky had finally remembered her. She went outside and stood on the porch while the rain poured down, letting it soak her hair and her shoes. And for a moment, she felt vividly present, alive in the wet air, aware that she could still choose to step forward or back, still choose to move at all. When the garden shimmered under a thin film of water, every leaf outlined in silver, and in that fragile brightness she saw both the cost and the gift of being the one who notices what others overlook. It wasn't resolution, not yet, but it was movement, and movement was the first honest thing she had felt in months. The escalation was not a shout. It was the steady accumulation of moments that refused to fit back into their old containers, the knowledge that stillness itself could be a form of decay. And though she would wake the next morning to the same walls and the same clock gaining its 2 minutes, she would also wake with a faint, private certainty that something in her had started to turn, not toward an ending, but toward a version of herself that could still change. For weeks, she had moved through her days like a careful observer of someone else's life, touching objects without quite feeling their temperature, speaking only enough to prove she was still part of the ordinary noise of the world. But one morning, something imperceptible altered the texture of time itself, as though a door inside her had been left ajar during the night, and a thin draft of recognition slipped through. She bought a single pair and carried it home, wrapped in paper, not because she was hungry, but because she wanted to hold something that bruised easily and still chose to ripen. The act was absurdly small, yet it steadied her. And when she placed the fruit on the table, she saw how the sunlight leaned toward it, how the world, indifferent as it was, still offered illumination to whatever dared to stay visible. That afternoon, she opened the cupboard where her unused notebooks were stacked, a quiet archive of good intentions, and pulled one down without knowing what she planned to write. The pages smelled faintly of dust and starch, and the first line came to her like breath rather than thought. I am still here. The words looked almost fragile, but seeing them in ink was enough to shift the weight of the room. She began to write without pause, not about loss or memory, but about the smallest movements of the present. The color of the pear skin darkening near the stem, the sound of the kettle before it boiled, the tilt of light that marked the hour before. Evening. By the time the page was full, her hand ached, and she realized that the ache was a form of proof that her body was capable of recording what her mind had nearly erased. It was not healing yet, but it was the first evidence that silence could be taught to speak again. Over the next day, she kept writing, quietly, deliberately, as though retraining herself to inhabit sentences that did not apologize for existing. She found that her attention sharpened in strange ways. She noticed the rhythm of footsteps in the apartment above, the faint murmur of radio voices drifting through the walls, the way her own reflection paused half a heartbeat before mirroring her. Movements. Each detail was an anchor, pulling her back from the dull current that had been carrying her nowhere. Once, when the postman knocked, she startled at the sound, then laughed aloud because the laughter came uninvited and unashamed. She thanked him too many times for the single envelope he handed her, and after he left, she stood by the door, listening to her own voice still echoing faintly in the hallway, like a visitor reluctant to leave. In the evenings, she walked longer routes through the neighborhood, not because she had destinations, but because she wanted to test how far the body could follow the heart once it remembered its own gravity. The houses she passed glowed with the soft anonymity of domestic life. blue light from televisions, curtains drawn, the smell of soup drifting through cracks in windows. And she felt neither envy nor exclusion, only the odd intimacy of being among others who were also imperfectly enduring. Sometimes she stopped by the bridge where the water moved sluggishly under a net of streetlights, and there she would rest her hands on the railing and imagine that everything she had been holding on to too tightly could flow away without needing permission. It was never dramatic, just a quiet negotiation between the self that feared vanishing and the self that wanted to begin again. One night, returning from such a walk, she found a letter slid beneath her door. It was not from anyone she recognized. The handwriting was careful, almost old-fashioned, and inside there was only a single sentence. "Your absence has been noticed." There was no signature, no return address. She stared at it for a long time, feeling an unexpected mixture of alarm and gratitude. Someone had seen her, even if only as a shadow moving through the edge of their awareness. The idea that she could leave a mark, however faint, dissolved a loneliness she hadn't admitted was still lodged in her chest. She pinned the note to the kitchen wall, beside the calendar that no longer held appointments, and every morning she glanced at it as if it were a compass. Gradually, the shape of her days changed. The lists she used to write became shorter, their items less about maintenance and more about curiosity. Visit the park, learn the bus route to the museum, buy a plant that grows even in poor light. Each completed act built a thread between the version of herself that watched and the one that lived. When she walked through the market now, the vendors greeted her by name, and she answered without that old hesitation that made her voice sound borrowed. The world hadn't softened. It was still indifferent, still full of noise and haste, but she had discovered a way to meet it without shrinking. The midpoint of her story was not an event, but an alignment, the moment when she recognized that continuation itself was an act of defiance. She did not need to be extraordinary. She needed only to be deliberate. She began to open the windows earlier in the morning, letting in both the chill and the possibility that came with it. She rearranged the furniture one quiet afternoon, not for utility, but to see the room differently. And when the light fell across her desk at a new angle, she caught herself smiling, a slow, inward smile that felt like the first phrase of a song she hadn't played in years. There was no audience, no applause, just the hum of the refrigerator, the pulse in her wrist, and the sense that she had crossed some invisible line between endurance and motion. When she went to bed that night, she left the notebook open on the table, the page half filled with words that trailed into silence. It did not feel unfinished. It felt alive, waiting, the way a seed waits for the weight of soil before deciding to rise. The season shifted before she noticed, and when she did, it was not through the calendar, but through the subtle disobedience of the light. Mornings no longer arrived cleanly, but leaked through the sky in uneven shades, as if time itself had grown careless. And with that carelessness came the first true test of the small calm she had built. She had begun to feel steady again, comfortable even, as though the weeks of deliberate stillness had turned into something stronger than habit. But the world has a way of testing every fragile structure the moment it begins to look solid. It started with a letter from an old acquaintance, a name she had almost forgotten, written in a script that carried too much confidence, the kind of handwriting that assumed it would be welcome. Inside, the words were friendly but intrusive, a suggestion that she might come back, attend a gathering, step once more into a circle she had quietly left behind. She read the invitation twice and felt the old unease return, not because of the offer itself, but because of the realization that her disappearance had been noticed by people who would never understand why she had chosen it. For days, the envelope lay on the table like a small, polite threat. She told herself that she owed no explanations, that peace, once found, should not require justification. Yet she could not stop the ripple that the letter set in motion. She remembered how easily she had once adjusted herself to fit the comfort of others, how quietly she had practiced disappearance long before anyone noticed she was gone. The realization stung, not with nostalgia, but with recognition. A week later, another knock at the door, another reminder that isolation, however chosen, could not protect her from intrusion. This time, it was the neighbor, a kind woman with a habit of hovering between curiosity and care, holding a bundle of mail that had been misdelivered. They exchanged polite words, the kind that fill the space between strangers who wish to remain polite. But then the neighbor asked gently if everything was all right, if she ever had visitors, if perhaps she needed company. For the rest of the afternoon, she moved through the rooms, unsettled, aware of how quickly solitude can be misread as loneliness, how easily independence can be mistaken for neglect. She began to sense a shift in how the world perceived her, or perhaps only in how she imagined it did. People at the market looked a little longer, their greetings tinged with curiosity, and the air itself seemed charged with an invisible scrutiny. She tried to dismiss the feeling, to remind herself that attention was fleeting, that most people thought of others only in passing, but the unease remained, gathering weight each day like dust on an unused shelf. At night, one evening, a package arrived without a return address. Inside was a small photograph printed on matte paper, a street scene she did not recognize, yet in the corner, reflected faintly in a window, was a figure that looked very much like her. The discovery unsettled her more than it should have. It might have been coincidence, an echo of someone else, but she felt in her bones that it was a reminder from the life she had left, that nothing ever vanishes completely. She placed the photograph in a drawer and tried not to think about it, though its presence hummed at the edge of her awareness like a low note that refused to resolve. In the days that followed, she grew restless. Her writing, which had once steadied her, now faltered. The sentences sprawled and collapsed under the weight of unspoken questions, and even the pear tree outside her window, once a quiet companion, began to lose its leaves prematurely, scattering them across the porch like the aftermath of something she had forgotten to prevent. So she began, hesitantly, to engage again, but on her own terms. She attended the next market with her head uncovered, her pace unhurried, and when a stranger asked if she lived nearby, she answered without apology. She noticed that another letter arrived, this time typed, formal, asking her to confirm details about something she had long refused to discuss. It was nothing urgent, a bureaucratic matter perhaps, but it carried the echo of the past she had tried to outgrow. When she sealed the envelope, she understood that dignity could be quiet and still contain the force of a storm. As the days lengthened toward the end of the season, she found herself walking again by the river. It reminded her that permanence exists, but only in motion, in the slow reshaping of what yields instead of resists. The realization filled her with a calm so deep it almost frightened her. She knew then that the world would continue to test her, to send its letters, its knocks, its ghosts. But she also knew she had learned the shape of her own endurance. That night she wrote again, her words longer, looser, stretching across the page like a tide returning to shore. She wrote not to explain, but to witness, to prove, if only to herself, that resilience could be as patient as the river, that every disturbance was an invitation to deepen. When she finally set down the pen, the room felt lighter, the air less confined. Somewhere beyond the window, a dog barked once and fell silent, and she smiled at the sound, not because it meant anything profound, but because it meant she was listening again, fully, without fear. The moment did not arrive with fanfare, nor with the precision of a plan finally executed. It arrived the way dawn does, unnoticed until the light is already in the room, until the walls reveal their true color and the shadows retreat to their corners. She had known, long before she admitted it, that the quiet she had been building was not meant to last untouched. Every piece carries within it the seed of its own disturbance. And now that seed had begun to open. It started with an impulse so small it might have gone unrecorded. A decision to visit the post office rather than drop a letter in the nearest box, to stand in line, to hold the envelope in her hand until it was her turn to approach the counter. The act itself was nothing, a minor errand, but she felt the weight of it as she walked, a steady pull through the chest, like a cord resolving at last. The city felt sharper that day, as if every edge of the familiar had been filed anew. People hurried past her, tethered to their own errands, their own invisible stories, and for once she did not shrink from their momentum. She moved among them as if she were part of a current rather than a spectator, and by the time she reached the post office, the air around her had changed. The clerk behind the counter looked up with the bland attentiveness of someone who measures life in transactions, but when she placed the envelope down, she did so with a precision that drew his gaze. "Registered," she said, her voice calm, and he nodded without curiosity. When she stepped outside again, she stood for a moment on the steps, the faint breeze brushing her face, and realized that she had crossed something invisible. The act was complete, irreversible, small in scale, but vast in consequence because it had been chosen entirely by her. As she walked home, the city seemed to expand around her. The noise, the shifting light, the scent of coffee and exhaust, all of it blended into a single pulsing rhythm that matched the one under her ribs. It was not triumph she felt, nor relief, but a steady clarity, the kind that arrives when resistance has finally spent itself. She understood now that waiting for permission had been the slowest form of disappearance, that even silence demanded an audience if it was to remain honest. Every step she took was an acknowledgement that she had outgrown the posture of endurance. She was now inhabiting the version of herself that acted without apology. At home, she opened the windows wide and let the afternoon enter. The air carried the scent of dust and rain, and somewhere a radio played a song from decades earlier, its melody faint but unmistakable. She stood listening, letting the notes drift across her skin, and felt the strange sensation of being both the listener and the remembered sound. For years she had lived as if the past were a room locked from the outside, but now she realized that the key had been in her pocket all along. The music on the radio ended, replaced by static, and she did not turn it off. The static was a kind of music, too, the echo of everything unresolved. As evening fell, she gathered the loose pages of her notebooks, the scattered reflections, the lists that had become confessions, the fragments of sentences that had trailed into silence, and arranged them on the table. Together they formed no coherent story, yet each line carried the same quiet defiance, a refusal to vanish. She read through them slowly, tracing the changes in her own handwriting, the shift from hesitation to confidence, from apology to assertion. It was all there, the record of a transformation so gradual that only time itself could have measured it. She did not need to understand it fully. It was enough to witness it. Then came the knock at the door, the kind that carries weight without aggression, a sound both expected and unwanted. She stood very still, considering whether to answer. Outside, the hallway light flickered once, and she thought of how often in her life she had moved toward voices that claimed to know what was best for her. This time, she remained where she was. The knocking continued, softer now, almost a plea, and then stopped. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like a question being withdrawn. She waited another minute before walking to the door, placing her hand on the knob, but not turning it. "Not today," she whispered, and stepped back. The sentence was an act of completion, more binding than any signature. When she turned away from the door, the room felt larger, as though the act of refusal had stretched its walls. She sat down at the table again and began to sort the pages into two piles, those that belonged to the past, and those that pointed toward something she could not yet name. Into the first she placed every note written in defense, every apology disguised as reflection. Into the second, every unfinished sentence, every question left open. When she was done, the second pile was thicker. She taught the city. She made tea, not out of habit, but as a deliberate offering to the moment, and carried the cup to the window. Steam curled upward, vanishing into the cool air. She thought about how much of her life had been spent holding back words, waiting for the right listener, the right time, the right permission, and she realized how little any of that mattered now. The world would continue whether she spoke or not, but she had finally learned the quiet power of naming herself aloud. Before bed, she returned to the open window and looked out across the roofs toward the thin strip of horizon where the last light was fading. There was no triumph in her face, no need for it, only the calm certainty of someone who had stopped negotiating with what could not be changed. She closed the window, turned off the lights, and stood for a moment in the near dark, aware of the steady rhythm of her own breathing. When she lay down, sleep came easily, not as escape, but as recognition. The culmination of her long, quiet struggle was not victory in the world's sense, but a return to balance within herself. She dreamed, though she would not remember the details later, of walking along a road bordered by fields, the air clean, the horizon open. In the dream, she did not look back. Morning arrived without ceremony, soft and pale, the kind of light that makes every surface seem newly washed. She woke before the alarm and lay still for a while, listening to the house breathe. The air. For a long moment she let the sound fill the space where thought usually lived, and she understood that this was what peace really felt like. Not triumph, not relief, but the simple recognition that nothing demanded her attention. The storm of yesterday, whatever shape it had taken, was finished, and what remained was the quiet weight of continuity. She rose slowly, each movement deliberate, as though teaching her body the language of gentleness again. The kettle. She sat. Everything she realized resolves itself through disappearance. Water into air, sound into silence, pain into memory. There was comfort in that inevitability. The world outside was already awake. A child. None of it asked anything of her, yet all of it seemed to welcome her return to awareness. She thought about how long she had lived in partial absence, measuring her worth against the expectations of others, mistaking withdrawal for safety, and she smiled, an unhurried inward curve of the mouth that needed no witness. The past, with all its noise and insistence, had not vanished. It had merely settled into its proper place, a landscape behind her rather than a cage around her. When she stepped outside, the air met her like an equal. The pavement she walked without destination, allowing her feet to choose the turns and every ordinary thing she passed. The shop window displaying its imperfect fruits, the scent of coffee from an unseen cafe, the low hum of conversation drifting from an open door. A woman nodded to her in greeting. She returned the gesture, small but genuine, and for the first time in a very long time, the exchange did not feel like performance. It was simply the world recognizing itself in another of its forms. By mid, she found a bench near the square and sat watching the slow choreography of people crossing paths, each one absorbed in a private narrative, each one temporary and magnificent in their ordinariness. She read the heart. Inside, the rooms greeted her with their familiar arrangement of shadows. She placed her coat on the chair, opened a book without caring which page it was, and let her eyes drift over the words until the sentences became texture rather than meaning. The house. She stood for a moment in its circle, understanding that endings are not closures, but clearings, spaces in which the next moment can take root. She whispered something to herself, a promise or perhaps a blessing, she couldn't tell, and felt no need to repeat it. The night would remember for her. Later, as she drifted toward sleep, she thought of how every journey, no matter how small, eventually returns to stillness, and how that stillness is not an absence, but a form of presence too complete to require sound. The day folded itself around her like a slow breath, and before her eyes closed, she felt the faint vibration of the world continuing, steady and unhurried, carrying her along with it.